everyone, my name is Rachelle Rathbone. I'm an engineer residing in Seattle, originally from Sydney. This would have been my first ever in-person on a big scary stage conference talk, but alas, it is 2020, so here we are in an online format, which I do have some experience with. And here today in Cascadia's first ever virtual conference, I'd like to talk to you all about something that's near and dear to my heart, and so I present to you, oh sweet GIF, a lightning talk. Now first things first, for all of you out there that cringed when I said GIF, I just want to remind you we all have our own way of pronouncing things. Tomato, tomato. Potato, potato. GIF, GIF. Emu, emu. Each to their own. None of these pronunciations is incorrect. Well, that is except for emu. I hate to break it to the American listeners out there. There is no such thing as an Australian emu. Now I'd like to share something a little personal about myself, and that is that I have epilepsy. And this beautiful black-eyed version you see of me here, well, this is a photograph taken in the ER shortly after my second ever seizure, which took place in a classroom full of second grade students. I used to be an elementary school teacher, and one afternoon I was teaching my class. My head started to feel a little bit funny, and the next thing I remember is coming to, on the ground, looking up at the ceiling with my principal, the deputy, my husband, and an ambulance officer staring down at me. Now, one good thing about my epilepsy is that I have never gone into seizure after being exposed to any one particular thing in my external environment. The best part is I haven't had a seizure in over 10 years. But the reason this was a good thing when I was having seizures was that it meant that I never had to eliminate or avoid anything in my day-to-day life just to keep myself safe. Thankfully, because of this, being the GIF lover that I am, I have been able to enjoy GIFs without abandon. I use them as a frequent form of communication to converse with my husband, friends, family, colleagues, the Twitter sphere, pretty much anyone I talk with online. In fact, I tend to ask myself the question when I go to send a message, can this be said with GIF? Now, what do GIFs have to do with epilepsy? Well, I mentioned that I am fortunate that I've never gone into seizure from being exposed to anything particular in my external environment, but this is not the case for all people with epilepsy. Some people have what's known as photosensitive epilepsy, and one of the things that can cause someone with photosensitive epilepsy to go into seizure are rapidly moving, flashing images. So in other words, my beloved GIFs. Now don't worry, if you happen to have someone in your life that has photosensitive epilepsy, they won't typically go into seizure when exposed to one rapidly flashing moving image, but it does become a problem for them when there are multiple of these or when the image is large. Enter Gific. This is an application that I first built at the end of the first quarter of a 6-month programming bootcamp course I attended. It's an application that allows users to build comic-like strips using GIFs. I had so much fun the first time I built this, I always wanted to go back and do it, and this year I finally had that chance. Now initially I got really excited about the tech stack, because end of Q1, all I'd been taught was the front end, so understandably Gific was a little bit limited in what it could do. Fast forward to now, and I felt like the world was my oyster in terms of the tech that I could choose from. However, at the end of the day, we all know that our users, unless they're developers, they don't care what our applications are built in. First and foremost, they want to be able to use our web apps, and secondly, they want to have a good experience while using them. So I decided to shift my main focus to other areas that do matter to our users. Performance. I'm going to have an application filled with GIFs. I want to make sure they load quickly, my page load time doesn't suck, my app is snappy. Security. I want to make sure I'm not storing any sensitive data in the browser, only allowing access to my resources from my domain, all the things that we typically think of when trying to build a secure application. Accessibility. Almost as soon as I thought of the word accessibility and tried to apply it to GIFs, I realized I didn't really know how you would make a GIF accessible. I figured I would include an alt tag, treat it like any image so that way screen readers could read their content, but outside of that, I didn't really know what to do. 3 in 20 people in the world have a disability, and of that number, just over half go online. Each type of disability requires us as developers to make minor modifications to our applications to make them accessible. Now, for the purposes of GIFic, if I just focus on the number of people in the world who have epilepsy, and thought, well, if just over half of that number goes online, and a fraction of that number has photosensitive epilepsy, I'm still looking at a pretty big number of people globally who might have a problem with GIFic if I can't figure out how to make GIFs accessible. So I went to the W3C website to do some research, and the first line of content is this question: are animated GIFs on your website considered accessible content? Which is immediately followed by this. And the reason for this is that rapidly flashing moving images such as GIFs break the WCAG 2.2.2 pause, stop, and hide guideline, which essentially says any blinking, moving, or scrolling content that starts automatically, lasts longer than 5 seconds, or is presented in parallel with other content, fails to meet this guideline. Initially, this is a pretty disheartening thing for me to read. Here I am building an application that's very foundation lies upon rapidly moving, flashing images. But then I realized the guideline itself was actually telling me how I could modify my application to make it accessible. So I'm just going to do a video demo of GIFic now. And for the most part, what you see here, this is GIFic exactly how I planned it to be, minus pending features, prior to looking at it from an accessibility standpoint, with one tiny addition. And that is this toggle switch up here in the navbar. Now, most of you have probably seen this before. A lot of developers use it to allow their users to toggle between light and dark mode. Well, I've decided to use it to allow my users to toggle between auto-playing GIFs and pausing GIFs. So when you land in GIFic, all GIFs across the site will be paused by default. Now, if we were to pretend to make a GIFic right now, so let's go ahead and we'll just click on the random title button, randomly generated title, attractive pebble, chubby hyena, that will do. So now we're going to search for hyena, and you'll notice that all of the GIFs that we get back in the response that render to this modal, they are all motionless and they're all in their pause state. So now if we go ahead and click on one, I now have the option to play, and if I click play, the GIF will now animate for a total of 4 seconds, keeping it within that 5-second window and then return to its pause state. So now if I go up to the navbar, I can toggle and the GIF jumps into that automatic looping animation we're all familiar with. And now if we go back, pull open that modal again, let's do a random search, you'll now notice that all of the GIFs I'm getting back from Giphy are all animated. So I'll go ahead and add one of those. And as I said, this is across the entire site. So if we go to the gallery, you can see that all the GIFs here are auto-playing, toggle back to pause. And if I click through to any of the previously made GIFics, we can see that all of the GIFs have the option to play. And then if I toggle back, they all automatically play. Now, what I've done here is not rocket science. It's merely looking at my application and trying to figure out ways that I can modify it to make it accessible to all of my potential users. And this tiny modification was a little bit of extra work on my part, but it's not just going to help people with photosensitive epilepsy. There's probably people who have temporary ailments who may find themselves on GIFic. They might have nausea, they might have light sensitivity. There's probably people out there who just have paused GIFs as a personal preference. We've all been to sites that we find infuriating and don't want to go back to. From the sites that simply have terrible page load time, to the sites that have way too much noise. We as developers tend to be really good at identifying the things that are problems for all of our users and not including those in our applications, but we're not always so good at identifying the things that are problems for some of our users and modifying our application to make the experience better for them. We've all heard the term mobile first, and in fact, I'm willing to bet that some of you out there live and die by this term, especially since several years ago, Google started ranking websites using its mobile first indexing. So if you wanted your site to be at or near the top, you had to build for mobile first. Unfortunately, it doesn't matter how responsive your application is or how well it performs in the land of SEO. If you're failing to meet WCAG standards, you've already lost potential users. And so I'd like to propose a new way of thinking. Accessibility first. When implemented correctly, not only does it provide all of your users with the desired experience, it could improve your search engine optimization and increase your site's organic search rankings. Thanks for listening to me today, everyone. Again, my name is Rachelle Rathbone. Feel free to censor any questions you have down in the chat. Otherwise, you are more than welcome to reach out to me later with any questions or feedback you may have.
Yay! Thank you so much for that, Rachelle.
All right.
I'm sorry that you weren't able to have your first big stage event, but I'm glad that you came with us today anyway. This was great.
Yeah, it's a little disappointing to not be up on a stage, but this whole process has still been great. Working with you guys has been amazing. And I'm a little laggy as well, by the way, in case you haven't noticed.
Oh, it doesn't look laggy on my end, so I'll pretend
maybe it's just me.
It's perfect. Yeah, yeah. I know for me, I can see myself as laggy and not laggy, so you might have the exact same view. But anyway.
Interesting.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much for speaking about this. We've got a bunch of questions already coming in, and it's such a cool project. I thought that was great. I'm curious because you mentioned the pausing of the GIFs is how I pronounce it, but we can still be friends, of course, like you said. Should our websites pause them by default to make them more accessible, or is that the kind of thing where it's a preference thing? Are there any guidelines on that?
I think, well, if you're going to go off the WCAG standards, if you're using just one, as I mentioned, that's not usually a bad thing for anyone that has photosensitive epilepsy. But if it's like my application, like GIFic, where there's multiple of them, then you should definitely think about pausing them by default.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I noticed in, for example, Discord, they make it so they're paused unless you have the window focused too, which I think is a really interesting approach as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. And I've noticed that Twitter kind of does pause them sometimes, but it feels like it's not really consistent.
They kind of do. Yeah, I can't tell what Twitter's rules are for that. But anyway, we have some other questions from people. In your project, does the whole GIF load before the paused frame is visible, or are there performance benefits to only showing one frame?
What do you mean in one frame in what part of the application?
Do you? Sorry, can you? So I think the question is specifically saying like when you have them load on the page, do you show the paused frame first and then load the rest of the image, or do you load it all at once?
Just the pause frame first.
The pause frame first. Okay. Interesting.
That does help with performance. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. And also for the paused state, are there APIs for actually implementing that? Is that something native in the browser that we don't know about, or is there a library or package that you used for it?
There very well could be potentially, but what I've done is actually incredibly simple. When you get the response back from Giphy, all of the GIFs come back in an object, and inside that object, they actually have a ton of URLs. And so I'm just using two of the URLs. One's a video URL and one's a still. And so I'm just switching, like literally just switching between those. Yeah, the Giphy object you get back for each GIF is actually kind of huge. Yeah, so it's really easy. So when I said it was like a really small amount of work on my behalf, I was not kidding.
That's perfect though then, because that means you don't even have to worry about the image loading performance or anything. It's truly just a URL shift. That's really interesting. Yeah. Neat. Well, another question, because people are very interested in just your side projects and stuff in general. Do you have any advice for folks working on their own side projects on how to make them more useful, how to make them more accessible, or just motivation for getting started?
Yeah, if you're working on side projects, definitely make sure it's something that you love. The reason I went back to this is, as I mentioned, I originally built this several years ago, and I've been thinking about it for a long time. It's something that I've just had fun. It's kind of a silly project, right? But it was something that I really, really enjoyed. So that's definitely like the best starting point. Pick something that you're just going to have fun with. It doesn't necessarily have to be anything that anyone ever uses, but and then try and implement some different tech into it, obviously.
Right. That keeps your motivation up to maintain it and work on it and stuff too. Because if you don't like it, then what's the point? It's your side project time, not your work time.
Yeah. Yeah, and then like I said, I had fun kind of picking different tech and Yeah,
and again, loved your talk. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for pointing out the emu thing, because that was one that bugged me a lot. And I saw that, I was like, yes, finally someone said it. So,
yeah, anytime one of my American friends says emu, yeah, it's a hard thing for me to listen to.
That's kind of like, I don't like it when people say mature instead of mature. That's a similar kind of thing with the U. That bugs me a lot.
Yeah, right there with you.
Anyway, we're getting off track. Thank you again so much for being here. Your talk was awesome, and
thank you for having me.
You're staying happy, healthy. Thank you so much. Up next, we have Fred speaking, and he is going to be our last talk of the day. Let's go.